Good evening. I'm Paul Zients, and I'm Dean of the College of Education at DePaul University, and I welcome you tonight to one of our fabulous forums that deal with provocative and interesting topics that are timely and unfortunately sometimes too timely because of the dramatic impact that they have on our schools and our children. We have been doing these forums for 12 years under the leadership of Diane Horowitz. The topics have brought in hundreds of thousands of people, and hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands of people. And we're very, very proud for the quality of work that has been done thus far. And tonight is no different. So tonight I would like to introduce you to Marie Donovan, who will be facilitating tonight's presentations.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Paul said, it's been over 12 years since the College of Education initiated these forums, which were the brainchild of my colleague, Dr. Diane Horowitz. And these forums remain an opportunity for our students and the broader Chicagoland community to gather and learn with, as well as through, local and national educators, researchers, and activists dedicated to explicating the critical education issues that directly affect our collective work. And developing and offering these forums is, frankly, it's a labor of love, and it's been shouldered primarily by their founder, Dr. Horowitz. And so in addition to offering my many thanks to Diane for her vision and her unstinting dedication, I also want to thank Ms. Camille Laxamana for her forum administration, and especially for being our web guru. Thank God for Camille. And I'm also grateful to Mr. Will Moody, who's been our behind the scenes and will continue to be our behind the scenes virtual connector this evening. And we all at DePaul especially appreciate the efforts of the Illinois Association of School Librarians and the Chicago Teachers Union for publicizing our event tonight. And it's been through the ongoing support of Dr. Paul Zients, our dean, to whom over 12 years of thanks are offered tonight, that we've explored, as he alluded to earlier, a wide range of topics in these forums: school closings, social justice and LGBTQ+ curricula, the effects of poverty on children's mental health, and more. We enjoyed a once-in-a-lifetime moment with civil rights leader Bob Moses and members of the Algebra Project. And we also were blessed with having a moment with Gone Too Soon Chicago Teachers Union leader Karen Lewis. And so, across these years, our format, we've kept it pretty much the same. We ask our speakers to share what's on their expert minds as well as what's in their hearts. And we in the audience, we sit and we listen and we ponder. And we ask ourselves and everyone else in attendance the question that St. Vincent de Paul persistently posed to his confreres hundreds of years ago: what must be done? Tonight's forum is the first of a planned quarterly series on literacy. We focus this evening on understanding literacy writ large, what literacy means to a free people, and what the current threats to accessing literature, as well as the people who safeguard our right to read, will mean for our democracy's future. Our February forum will focus on the calculated disinformation efforts that clog our digital and headspaces daily, and how to counter them with practical curriculum ideas that K-12 teachers can use with their students. And then our final forum in May will be devoted to examining the current controversies in teaching children how to read, which sadly are ratcheting up to be more than mere skirmishes in yet another reading war. So please keep an eye on your inboxes for more details about these forthcoming events too. Now, our honored speakers tonight are two known activist librarians. Ms. Tracie Hall is the 10th Executive Director of the American Library Association, the ALA, which is the oldest, formed in 1876, and the largest, over 50,000 members, professional library association in the world. A native of South Los Angeles, Ms. Hall is proud to note that she received her first library card at the Watts branch of the Los Angeles Public Library. Prior to joining the ALA in February 2020, her many other library and arts leadership roles included serving as Culture Program Director at the Joyce Foundation, where she created programs that advanced racial inclusion and equitable funding in arts administration. And she also was the Deputy Commissioner of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, overseeing visual and performing arts, film and community programs, and receiving many citations for her work to advance arts access through expanding neighborhood arts venues and mounting outreach events in arts deserts. She was president of strategy and organizational development for the Queens Library System in New York, where she founded the New York City Early Learning Network. And I'm thrilled to share that in another 2 weeks, on November 16th, the National Book Foundation will recognize Ms. Hall with their Librarian Award for her outstanding service to the American literary community in honor of her career-long dedication to ensuring equal access to information, to books, to libraries, to literacy for all. Now, joining Ms. Hall tonight is Ms. Nora Wiltse, who many of you recognize from local media coverage about our disappearing school librarians and libraries. Ms. Wiltse is in her 20th year as a Chicago Public Schools librarian. She started her career serving in Chicago elementary schools in our Englewood, Pilsen, and North Center neighborhoods. She now works as the librarian for the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. College Prep High School in Kenwood. A National Board Certified Library Media Specialist, Ms. Wiltse chairs the Chicago Teachers Union Librarian Committee, and she also serves on the Board of Directors of the American Association of School Librarians. In 2020, Ms. Wiltse's career-long advocacy for every child in every Chicago school to have a certified school librarian earned her the American Library Association's Elizabeth Futis Catalyst for Change Award. Now, we realize that you are over 200 registrants, university students, faculty and staff, as well as public and school librarians, teachers, school board members, interested citizens are here because you too want and need to listen, to ponder, and to share during this, yet another extraordinary time in our nation's history. Sadly, author-activist James Baldwin's 1963 remarks to New York City teachers still resonate with us today, as you see here. Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is in one way or another aware of that. We are in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular that word has become in this country. The society in which we live is desperately menaced from within. Your showing up tonight to be part of this conversation gives me and everyone else in attendance hope. Please know that. Our sincere desire is that tonight's event sparks you to action or renewed action. So as you settle in for the next hour or so, I trust you'll keep Dr. King's enduring words in mind. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Thank you for coming again, and thank you in advance for not being silent tonight. Please join me now in welcoming Ms. Tracie Hall. Tracie?
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here, and I want to thank everyone who is listening and participating. I can't wait to hear your feedback. I am going to try to make really good use of my time and let some of the notes that I want to share with you really speak for me. I really want to get into the heart of the matter. I think that as some of the quotes suggest that Marie shared, we are in a time of urgency. And we are in a time of urgency around something very fundamental, and that is really thinking about the role of the right to read in helping us to sustain our democracy. And I will be addressing that from two vantage points. And so I will get into it here. And I want to really thank our colleagues at DePaul University for supporting the slides, because I tend to speak a lot with my hands, and I'll probably be doing some gesticulating here. So I am asking for support in advancing the slides. So looking forward to this conversation. So I want to address, I think, this notion of being out of the loop. and thinking about low literacy and generational poverty and what libraries can and are doing to close the gap. But I also want to impress upon you, as I am speaking, the importance of the library as a part of our social infrastructure. And very recently, I saw a meme on social media that singled out public libraries and said that if we as a democracy were voting on, or if we as political people today would be voting on the notion of the public library, it might not pass. It might not be something that we in 2022 would agree on. And I think that that saddened me, but it also has placed, I think, a lot of fire under my feet, especially in terms of this role that I occupy at the American Library Association and what the role of the American Library Association is today. If what we do, and this is part of our mission, is to ensure access to education and information for all, we have to understand that today that very mission is contested. So I really want, my goal is to impress upon you that libraries are fundamental to our social infrastructure as a democracy. And what does it mean to be outside of the loop in terms of not only being poor, but being information poor? And I'll describe that a little bit further. Next slide. So here are some key points. I want to talk about information access as a social justice and public health issue. And I want to talk about information access as, I think, tool number one in our arsenal to fight against generational poverty. I'll talk specifically about information poverty and what we must do in this increasingly digital age to mitigate information poverty, and why we've normalized it. I want to talk about what I think is the third great wave of library services. And this goes directly out to people who ask, what is the efficacy of libraries today? Do we even need libraries? And I think that that question is such an elitist question, because we know that the lowest income people in this country, the people who are at the 30% mark or lower in terms of income on average, are the great users of library services. And so as soon as I hear someone saying or asking me, oh, are libraries relevant? First of all, I always say that you are really pointing out your own privilege. So I want to talk about what it means to be in the third great wave of library services in an era where we have increasingly, where the wealthy have increasingly cloistered themselves. And finally, I want to talk about what I believe to be the next wave of the civil rights movement, which is the right to read. Next, please. So we are at a point in both our digital evolution and our social evolution where the three most critical quality of life indicators are access to education, access to employment, and access to public health. And all three of these access points rely on sophisticated comprehension in terms of reading, basic reading, and digital skills. So think about that. We're talking about difference between life and death. So I'm not in this presentation talking about information for information for leisure, information for recreation, and all those things are important and they have their place. Socrates asked, and asks us, is the unexamined life worth living? So I'm not asking that question here. I'm talking about participation in our democracy writ large, and also fundamentally access to education, employment, and public health, and the ways in which those three areas connect to how long we live and how we live. Next, please. So rather than just be sharing anecdotes or, opinions. I really wanted to go to one particular study that was published by Deutsche Bank, September 9th, 2020. And that date stands out for me and always will, because I remember encountering this study in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, and I was so disturbed at the findings that I immediately began reaching out to the senior economist for Deutsche Bank who authored the study, Abjad Walia, to talk to him about some of these points. And what he shared as I shared these points is that he said, this is still early on in the pandemic. And what we're already seeing is that we're seeing that access to information, one's ability to read, one's digital sophistication, et cetera, is going to make a difference in terms of how many communities are going to be able to recover from this pandemic, if they are able to recover at all. And these are some things that I think are really important that connect race, income, literacy, and access. One, that Blacks and Latinos are about 10 years behind their white peers in levels of consistent and high quality broadband access, and almost 4 times more Blacks in particular have poor tech connectivity than whites. Now, I live on the far south side of Chicago. I live in the Pullman community, and in my community and in the larger Roseland community, only 45% of households have either access to broadband, consistent broadband, or to a device. And so I definitely know that during the height of the pandemic, many of the people in my community were reliant on word of mouth in terms of who could sign others up for access to a vaccine. A lot of that, as we know, was being handled online. And so when it came to health access, when it came to just access in general in a mostly digital environment, I was able to see the toll that that was taking on my community. One of the tolls that it took in terms of poor access to connectivity across the country is that who had access to work from home was very much race jobs, was very much race and class. The people who were able to work from home were really reliant on the people who didn't have that opportunity. People who were delivering and doing frontline service work in terms of retail. What that called out is that specifically for Black people had to leave their homes 135% more often than white people. So where I hear a lot about disease and comorbidities, what especially in rationalizing why there was higher death and infection rates amongst Blacks, Latinos, Indigenous people, and other people of color. No one called out the fact, or very few studies called out the fact that just in actuality, people of color needed to leave their homes more often in order to continue their employment. And a lot of that is also because digital access and hybrid access and work from home has become increasingly white collar and increasingly what we saw during the pandemic, a privilege associated with race. More than half of Blacks and Latinos, if we're not able to repair this digital divide and who benefits from it, more than half of Blacks and Latinos could be underprepared for 86% of jobs by 2045. And if this is not addressed in one generation alone, the study concluded, the country's BIPOC residents could find themselves in an unemployment abyss. And this is the actual language taken from the study. So here, I just want to reiterate this conversation about why we're talking about literacy, the right to read, income, race, and why libraries factor into it is because libraries are the most visited public access point in this country, period. That school, public, and academic libraries. But libraries remain the largest provider of internet access and access to computers in the country as well. So when I see this, I think about not only the work of the American Library Association, not only my work as a librarian and as an administrative librarian, but the work that I have to do and the advocacy that I have to do as a citizen who cares about, not only cares about low income communities, but comes from one. Next, please. Now, I'm not going to read these slides to you, but on the left, I wanted to provide just as late as 6 years ago, just a share of how the aggregate wealth has shifted. This is between 1983 and 2016. We know that it has been much greater, but I haven't seen a study that gave me a visual so that we could really see the difference between upper income, middle, and lower income. And what we see is that we actually know today that the decline in middle and lower income is even steeper than we see here. But I also wanted to add that when we look on the right, we see that that race and poverty are still conflated, even before the pandemic in 2020. So I guess what I want to say here is that as our wealth gaps persist, what we're seeing is our information gaps and our public health gaps also grow greater. And this is something that we have to be mindful of. Next, please. So again, when we think about low income workers, people who are employed, because a lot of times, you know, we think about poverty and we think about unemployment. The reality is the vast majority of people who are poor or extremely low income are also working. That's the conundrum. And as my grandmother would say, that's the hurting thing about it. But when we look at the National Skills Coalition poll, recent poll of 2 years ago, when asking adults who are employed today if they could hold on to their current jobs, if there was any increased expectation of digital tools, usage of digital tools, or increase in digital navigation skills, about 31%, almost a third of workers said they didn't think they could even hold on to the jobs they have today if they were expected to increase their digital skill level. Now, at the heart of this is not just maybe, you know, being a Luddite or being afraid of technology, but it's basic reading access. So I want to, or reading skills. So I just want to make sure that you're looking at the factoids in the middle there that also speak to how we have normalized low literacy. So what we're seeing is the chicken's kind of coming home to roost. We have normalized low literacy for low paying jobs. We have normalized low education and under education, believing that it isn't a problem. And what we see is that it's really catching up to us. And again, in 2019, we see that those of us who take the participation online, or having the reading level to participate online, to both consume and create information, we are able to see coming out of the Pew Research Center that there is a large number of people who are not online at all. And that grows with the lower one's educational attainment level is, so that we see that people who haven't graduated from high school, almost 30% are not online. And then, you know, we see that number also growing in areas and dense urban areas, but also in rural areas, and certainly amongst older people, and then larger amongst people of color. Next, please. So what I want to call out here is that I believe that low literacy and low digital literacy, reading and digital literacy, low levels are threats to economic and democratic participation. And that very idea was called out almost 32 years ago by the National Governors Association. One of their 6 goals stated that by the year 2000, every adult American will be literate and will possess the knowledge and skills necessary to compete in a global economy and exercise the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. We are on the precipice of what could be a ground-changing and ground-shifting election. And as we decry who's not voting, oh, people in the community didn't come out to vote, I want you to think about literacy as a barrier. And I want us to think think about how we have normalized low literacy and how literacy is really the access point, or it is the portal to democratic participation and to voting, et cetera. And it always has. I know the historians amongst us you're shaking your heads. Yes, because we know that those two things have always been connected. Next, please. So again, I want to call out the notion of generational poverty. In information theory, what we understand is that poverty is compounded by information poverty. And when we don't have interventions on poverty, it moves beyond being cyclical or incidental, and it becomes generational. And I think that that's one of the things that we are facing right now. We are facing a new era of generational poverty in which families are being trapped in this cycle. And as we go to our next slide, I'll talk about why I think it is important that we look at that through an information lens. Next, please. So right here, I just want to state, when it comes to the American Library Association, because social responsibility, democracy, diversity and inclusion, sustainability, et cetera, are parts of our core values. We have had a long history of literacy advocacy, not only within the American Library Association, but supporting pro-literacy. One of my predecessors left ALA to become the president of Pro-Literacy, and we actually helped to found the National Coalition for Literacy, ALA did, and finally we're participating in an initiative of the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. So again, this is my infomercial, if you will, for literacy, because I think that this is public health and crisis number one, and we don't talk about it. And it also, I think, is connected to why we have become a prison industrial complex. Next, please. And I also want to call out literacies, a variety of literacies, and you can see them here: visual literacy, basic literacy, media literacy, financial literacy, civic literacy. How do I vote? Where do I vote? What does voting mean? What will it change? What will it do? Health literacy, and environmental literacy. And I want to add to these literacies, I want to add a recreational literacy, because we know that the use of parks, visits to free programs, visits to museums and galleries that may be free are also complicated when people have very low literacy, that the world contracts to the literacy level. So people do not venture out, they don't take chances as much, or they really rely on second and third party navigation and on a sense of welcome and belonging. And too often, many of our institutions, be they educational or recreational, sometimes don't have that overt sense of welcome or offer a sense of belonging. Next, please. So we have a long road to hoe, as my grandmother would say again, when it comes to literacy, when it comes to reading and adult literacy. And here is just a heat map going from darker blue, where we have higher levels of literacy, to lighter blue, where we have very low levels of literacy. And you can certainly see that, unfortunately, Illinois is not in a good space. And my native California and New York places where I've lived are even worse off. But we are now understanding that we have, in some cases, 2 out of 5 adults who don't read on a 5th grade level. And we also know that one of the biggest markers of low literacy for children is the literacy levels of their parents. And that also happens to be a marker for poverty. That head of household income is sometimes a determinant of offspring income. And so unless there are interventions, educational interventions, information interventions, social interventions, et cetera. Next, please. So I've been talking a lot about information poverty. I'm trying to sort of set the stage. I really am trying to build an argument. My goal is after my presentation, you won't take literacy for granted anywhere, that you will understand what I think is the importance of libraries in the period to come. And we will also understand how we have normalized low literacy, and also by doing that, really subjected entire communities and groups of people to experiencing information poverty. What is it? On the right, information poverty, Johannes Britz, information theorist at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, has described it as a situation in which individuals and communities do not have the requisite skills, abilities, or material means. They may not have access to broadband. They may not have the reading level or even the navigation ability, the instruction to obtain efficient access to information, to interpret it, and finally to apply it. In libraries, too often, we spend a lot of time talking about access. But if I'm preaching today, what I'm preaching is access is just the beginning. The end of that journey, or the terminus, is application. And again, information can be, poverty is further compounded when people don't have access to one of three things: financial capital, education, or connections to information or social networks where they can be sponsored or supported. So again, just thinking about poverty in a much less reductive way, and thinking about information poverty as one of the things that compounds poverty when it comes to wealth. Next. So when it comes to libraries, I think that we've experienced a lot of disinvestment. We just did a study out of the Public Library Association, one of our divisions, and what we found is that during the pandemic, about 30% of libraries have lost funding, they've lost staff, they've had to eliminate some of their hours. And just as we have kind of normalized blight, I think that we have like a level of privilege that is saying and even arguing, oh, libraries don't matter. But to whom? Housing matters to everyone, and I believe that access to information matters the same. So I think that this graphic tells it all. Next, please. So I've been spending a lot of my time talking about information redlining. I'm very much influenced by my adopted home of Chicago. My belief that information poverty and the normalization has led to information redlining, which is, as I describe it, the systematic denial of equitable access to information, information services, and information retrieval methods. And I can talk a lot more about that, and I likely will have the opportunity. Next, please. There's a long history of information redlining. I brought this slide just to make sure that we understand that it's not new. If we go to the next slide, I want to mention that compulsory illiteracy is something that we have seen through enslavement and in other cultures around the world, where a total power or totalitarian power seeks to withdraw information or the access to decipher information. So we know that in this country, we'll go to the next slide, please. The slave code laws or Black code laws, depending on your nomenclature, in nearly all of the slave holding states in the US, place harsh restrictions on reading and writing for Black people. In fact, teaching a Black person to read was one of the fines that could be attended to it was one of the offenses that was not only subject to fines, but even in some cases corporal punishment for people who were not Black if they were taught teaching a Black person to read. So I want to go back to our history to kind of talk a little bit about and situate why we have okayed whole groups of adults not knowing how to read. They're under education, and how we've normalized low literacy. Next, please. And here again is just example, an example of one of those slave code laws out of North Carolina. Next, please. But here's some good news. I think that we are in the third great wave of library services. I think that the first great wave of library services was in the Carnegie era, many other magnates who really began to link literacy to socioeconomic mobility and to worker productivity. In the second wave of libraries, great wave of library services in the latter 20th century, we had people like Bill Gates, who really relied on libraries to introduce personal computing to the masses. And I remember teaching those classes at Seattle Public Library in my early days. The first day of a week-long session on how to use a personal computer was dedicated to just using a mouse. And then finally, I think this next great wave of library services is going to be to exteriorize library and information services, to go beyond the bricks and mortar and into the digital space where we are now. We saw a great uptake in terms of library use during the pandemic as people who weren't relying on the library began to use more and more of the digital resources. But I also think that our role will be to close the digital literacy and the data access gap. Next, please. This is just visualizing the data. I just wanted to make sure that you, as I get ready to close here, that you're able to see, where we are. More than 92 million working age adults don't have the literacy instruction that they need. These are people who have been identified as having low literacy. So not only do we have a big issue with people having low literacy, we have a huge issue in that access to literacy instruction has relied on free and volunteer labor, has relied on churches and community-based organizations, and we haven't really taken that on. Even night schools and adult programs like night schools, remember Welcome Back Carter? Those programs have disappeared. And so a question that I have is, can we begin to imagine the contemporary library as also providing more literacy instruction? Some libraries already do, but that's not common across the country. Next, please, as I close. So I want to connect the dots between people who are unable to read to this new and escalating restriction on the right to read. We're now facing more book challenges in the United States than even during the McCarthy era, which hit its zenith between 47 and about 53. Started to wane in the mid-50s. But we are now seeing a small group, an outlier group of people politicizing the right to read. And why are they doing that? Not because they care about reading. When you see some of the challenges, you can see that they photocopied like one page out of a book that might have 200 pages and said, this is problematic. In fact, unfortunately, many of the people challenging the books don't read. And not because they can't, but because they choose not to. And so what's really interesting is that now we're in a place where libraries, which are really vulnerable in this conversation, are having to justify having access, sharing material that might not agree with everyone, and no book should agree with everyone. We don't want to censor our ability for writers to write their lived experiences or to write history. I mean, we're in an era that started with critical race theory and now is just problematizing the right to read. But what we know at the American Library Association, according to a poll that we conducted using a pollster who polled across the spectrum, is that 71% of Republicans and Democrats both agree that we should not be removing books from public libraries, and almost 70% agree that we shouldn't be removing books from school libraries. The American Library Association has also created, and we'll go to the next slide, Unite Against Book Bans. The Unite Against Book Bans campaign, you can go to uniteagainstbookbans.org, is so that we can make sure that free people continue to read freely, that we de-weaponize reading because we see it as a ploy. This is a political ploy. People don't care about education, and they really don't care so much about morals. What they care about is really hoarding power. And we want to make sure that we call that out for what it is and make sure that we raise a generation of people who are not afraid to read freely and to read things that they can ideate on, in which they see themselves. Next, please. So this is our pledge. I've been mentioning our core values. You see them called out here. Some of the ones that reference some of the ideas I've shared with you, I've underlined, and perhaps I could have underlined all of them. Next, please. So ways that we're fighting for information equity and access, ALA is calling for universal broadband. We believe that we should now have a fee-free internet, and that access to internet should not be predicated on one's income, but should be considered a human right. We're calling for the rapid diversification of the field, both in terms of race and ethnicity and language ability, as well as disability and sexual orientation. Libraries must reflect the people, because that's what we do. We collect the intellectual and cultural production record of the entire human race, and our field must do more to represent that. And finally, additional funding to broaden library and information access. Next, please. So that's it. I want to thank you so much. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce my co-speaker here, Nora. Nora, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Tracie. I didn't realize what a perfect prequel my speech will be for your information, because I am going to be talking specifically about school libraries and school librarians. And the disparities along racial and socioeconomic lines in adults in our country that Tracie just mentioned. We see those starting very clearly in our pre-K to 12 education. So first I'm going to talk about why school libraries are important, and then discuss a little bit about where we are right now as a country with our access to school librarians. The right to literacy, the right to read that Tracie talked about, really means having a school librarian. For students, that's really what it means. Students don't all have access to public libraries or bookstores, and students often don't have printed materials in their homes. And Tracie just also mentioned the discrepancy in broadband access as well, which is a part of this. So the school library really is the main source of reading materials for so many of our students. Just a personal note, when I taught on the south side of Chicago, I had students who did not feel safe going to their public library. They did not have bookstores in their community, and they did not have very many print resources often in their homes. I taught in my last elementary school. It was a very well-resourced school, and we had a fabulous public library and a wonderful independent bookstore blocks away from our school building. But even in that case, school was a very big source for books for my students. We averaged each student checking out 30 students on average per school year. So on either end of that spectrum, the school library was very important for access to books and access to reading. Beyond just that equalizing of access, there are so many studies on the benefits of having a school librarian. These studies, there's over 20, they go back for over 30 years. And it all boils down to the basic benefit is that students that have a school librarian score higher in reading. School librarians tend to have by data, have a stronger benefit to high school students than in elementary. And in fact, even the details of the number of visits a high school student has to their school library corresponds by raising literacy scores. This correlation to higher student achievement with having a school librarian, it remains even when variables such as household income, race, ethnicity, per pupil spending, and teacher pupil ratios are accounted for. So it's pretty powerful. So students need school libraries and school librarians for access to read, as I mentioned, and also it helps their achievement. So where are we in our country if we are this valuable and this important? Unfortunately, since 2010, there has been a 20% decline in the number of school librarians in our country. And this decline has not fallen equally across the country. The decline is much more rapid and has hit some communities much harder than others. Knowing my audience in this forum tonight, you can probably guess which students are more likely to still have a school librarian and which are not. The data for this, the research on where we are now across the country shows that the worst hit districts, the least likely to have school librarians are rural districts, charter schools, high poverty districts, majority Hispanic districts, and schools with higher number of English language learners. So our schools are segregated along race and socioeconomic lines. And so the loss of school librarians follows those lines, and it's an equity issue and a racial justice issue for these reasons. So I mentioned the data nationwide, and that for districts, districts with more students of color are more likely to lose librarians. Well, that's where we're at in Chicago today. So in Chicago, we have lost the number of school librarians has plummeted much more rapidly than as a country as a whole. And that probably has to do with the fact that almost 80% of CPS students are in poverty. 12% of CPS students are English language learners, which is higher than the country's average. And 89% of our students are students of color. So the district as a whole right now has school librarians in about 20% of our schools. So we had over 450 school librarians in 2012, and today we have around 100. We have around 600 schools in CPS. So really where we went from was having school librarians in 75% of our schools to where we're at now, which is having school librarians in 20% of our schools. And again, that loss of school librarians is not equal across the board. In CPS, only 10% of our majority Black schools have a librarian, compared to 27% of our majority white schools. So Chicago's hit harder than the nation, and then our south and west sides are hit harder than other areas of the city. So all of this sort of is continuing along the race and socioeconomic lines and the racist nature of this of our school system. So this connects with our right to read. It might be obvious to you, but I'm just going to spell it out, because if we want our students to have access to information and to be adults with the wide choices and jobs and all of those things that Tracie mentioned, they need to have access in their pre-K to 12 education. And there's, as Tracie mentioned, there's a nationwide uptick in censorship and book banning attempts. And those attempts, the banning and censorship of materials around our country, it's to remove access to those materials, right? They're not ceasing the printing of those materials. They are removing access to those materials in public libraries and in school libraries. So when you think about Chicago and you think about our students, with only 20% of them having a school library and a school librarian, do they have access to those materials in the first place? That is the connection I would like to make. And in May 2020, Lori Lightfoot, you might remember this tweet. She was in Texas and she tweeted a photo of herself reading To Kill a Mockingbird. And she said, no banning of books or thought ever. And then in September, she declared Chicago a book sanctuary city. And this was in direct response to the increase in censorship nationwide. So these are really important things. I'm really proud to live in a city that calls itself a book sanctuary city. We're a great city of libraries. But part of that picture is missing. When we are proud that we don't outright ban books, we have to still consider the access to those materials. And the fact is that Chicago students rarely have access to those materials in the beginning. So for example, a vivid picture of this is an LGBTQIA+, a middle schooler who considers themselves queer. They might not have a school library with access to books where they see themselves reflected. And we have the majority in CPS of our students are students of color. They might go all the way through high school without having an experience of reading a book with a main character that looks like them or lives like them. So these are some sad stories that we think about when we limit access in other areas of the country, but that is the case for our public school students here as well. So the other part of what I was asked to talk about, that wasn't depressing enough. I'm going to continue. So I was also asked to talk about a connection of teachers and school librarians working collaboratively together. This is more positive. And that's because this is DePaul's Department of Education and the master's program of education. And we have a lot of educators out there and future educators. And it may seem obvious to you, it may seem silly that I'm speaking to educators, I should say, about the importance of school librarians, but what we've learned is that more and more educators joining into our field have not had personal experiences with school librarians. So they might not have had a librarian in their pre-K to 12 experience. They might not have worked in schools or done student teaching in schools where there was a school librarian. And then of course, those educators can become administrators that have never had that experience as well. So I'm just going to be very clear and talk about why this is so important for all educators to understand. So I'm going to break it down into 3 reasons why I think school librarians are important, but of course there are a million reasons out there and there's different ways to categorize. But the first, it's easy for me to do 3. The first one that I want to talk about is just our collection development and in the fact that we have a school library collection that meets the needs of our students. So in education, for example, we have a 4th grade classroom and they have a few hundred books in their classroom library. That's fantastic. It does not serve the full needs of that student as a reader and as a learner. Within that 4th grade class, you might have a wide range of reading levels that need to have in our school library. We can have a broader range. But you also are going to have a 4th grader that wants to learn how to juggle and one that wants to know every fact about jaguars and one that wants to know, which I did have, 4th grader that wants to know everything you have about the War of 1812. And we just can't meet all of those needs in a classroom library. The school librarian is an expert in developing that collection based on the needs of those students and also pairing the right books with the right reader. That's really, educators are often excellent at this, but that is really our specialty. The second, so that was collection development and having just that collection for our whole school to use. The second strength I would mention is helping with the curriculum. So we have content experts, teachers are content experts, and infuse novel studies, book clubs, read alouds all throughout their curriculum. They really are the experts in that curriculum. But where school librarians come in is we are the experts at pairing current and culturally diverse books with your curriculum. So often the curriculum stays the same for years and years and years, and no one has the time or probably the time to just devote to updating that. And I'll give you a couple examples. In my elementary school, which in Chicago is K-8, We had always read To Kill a Mockingbird in 8th grade, and we had have a fabulous middle school social studies and language arts teacher, but we switched that over to be a companion novel along with Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. So now we have a more updated current option for students, and we have gone to an author who is a Black American. So that is really a great shift. In 3rd grade, we study westward expansion, as do most schools. The teachers came to me and asked if they should do Little House on the Prairie. We switched that. All the librarians out there know where I'm going with this. We read Prairie Lotus. We read The Birch Bark House, and those are books that share Native experiences and Asian American experiences of westward expansion, which is an important part of our American history to learn. Just updating that curriculum and keeping it culturally relevant. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about is information literacy and media literacy. So let's see, how am I doing with time? I think I'm going to tell you stories. I like talking.
You're fine, Nora. You're fine.
Okay.
Please, for teachers.
I know I'm going to tell you stories about my students. So for information literacy is just huge right now. We sometimes school libraries are seen as obsolete because of the internet, but it's kind of the opposite. Our students have so much information coming at them, and they need help synthesizing that, making sense of disparities, of differences in information that's coming at them. They need help understanding the difference between advertisements and scientific data. And as I'm saying this, adults, we all need this help as well, but it is so critical in this information age that our students have that. The example I wanted to use, the story I wanted to tell, I have often used this example in the past couple of years because I worked with my middle school students on teaching about different types of cognitive bias. And it was really wonderful because they are consumers with social media coming at them with information, and they often approach it, as do many adults, and as someone's really good at knowing if something's true, or someone's really bad at knowing if something is true. And usually other people are bad and we are good. We know when we see something come across instead that we know whether it's reliable or not, and other people might not. But really, with brain science, none of us are very good at it. Our brains aren't developed in that way. And so to learn about it as brain behavior and think about ourselves as consumers with companies coming to us and filtering, already curating what they're even showing us, and with tendencies of bias that we need to be aware of, it creates more powerful users of information. And instead of saying, oh, they're bad and I'm good at it, we can all kind of see and be more aware of the factors on our information. We have companies, social media companies, that are very specifically targeting and filtering what information we see, and having information literacy skills to know that is incredibly valuable to our students. A Google search is not just a Google search. My Google search is already filtered to me, right? So even in research skills and things that may seem pretty basic, school librarians are trained to have conversations about that and teach about all of that information that's coming at us. So we're not in a great place in our country right now. We're struggling in Chicago. However, we have these things that I mentioned school librarians can offer, and many others. I'm sure there's a million things I'm forgetting. But I was also asked to talk for just a couple minutes about what do we do now? So we know we don't have enough school librarians. We know that so many educators out there on this forum tonight might work in schools or in districts without school librarians. What do we do? Well, some of the answers are what we don't want to hear. Vote, talk to others. But I think the Tracie put up the Unite Against Book Bans, and that is a really great resource because Unite Against Book Bans has documents on there. They have articles on the importance of reading and the importance of a diverse collection for students and how valuable that is to them. So it gives really good talking points. Unite Against Book Bans also has a place on there. It has a place to sign a petition, but it also has a place to send a petition to your elected officials and say, hey, have you signed on this yet? I hope you join me in celebrating everyone's freedom to choose what they read with their family or what they read individually. School boards are a very, very important place right now. We have a nationwide targeted group that are running for school boards and working to have school boards censor and limit materials for students. So we need to go to our school boards or to our public library board meetings and share that we value the diversity in the collection and that we are not threatened by books that we might not agree with. So being vocal to your boards and to your elected officials is huge. I wish I had like an easy answer, but those things are very important. Or run for school board, better yet, run for your school board. Librarians and in particular, public librarians and school librarians really need to feel that support because it's been a time of targeting, and it's a nervous and kind of cautious time for us. So I would ask for your support. That is the end of what I had prepared, but I believe the next part is question and answer, right?
Yes, it is. We're at that point in our forum. And thank you again, Tracie and Nora. And before I share the questions that have come in, I'm wondering, well, a few things. First, as you were speaking, each of you, I had the slide and I wasn't going to use it in my opening remarks, but I hope that this sparks perhaps even more questions coming into our chat. And the themes that ran through your presentations here, I keep thinking about Toni Morrison saying how the historical suppression of writers is the earliest harbinger of the steady peeling away of additional rights and liberties that will follow. Again, we live in remarkable times, don't we? Revolutionary times, as Baldwin said. But he also said, those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by others doing it. And I'm especially heartened by both you and Tracie, by how you embody that. Like, can't be done? No, we're going to do it. We're librarians. We're going to do it. So again, before though I get to the questions, wondering, Tracie, is there something that you wanted to say to Nora, or Nora, is there something you wanted to say to Tracie?
Well, Nora, I just want to say that I am really grateful to you for your work. I think that in my practice as a librarian, which has been about 22 years now, I have really seen the ways in which library services in schools has been underfunded, unfunded, overlooked. And yet we know that the library is really the switching station for the school, right? It's where students connect to resources. It's where teachers connect to resources. It's where teachers connect to pedagogical aids, and where students connect to supplementary aids. And yet at the same time, it feels like it has really been subject to a level of disinvestment that very much connects to, I think, the larger conversation of why we've normalized information poverty for some groups. So I just want to thank you for doing the good work. And I know that we'll get into a deeper conversation. So maybe gratitude is what I want to share at this point.
Thank you. And right back at you. I know at the American Library Association, we talk about the ecosystem of libraries, and it just, every slide that you brought up, I was like, of course, that's what we're seeing, because we know, we can trace everything back. So I thought that was really interesting. The disinvestment starts very early on. So,
as you were talking too, I was struck by, I'm going to date myself. Back when I was in graduate school in the early 1980s, my doctoral program, I had the opportunity to work on a 3-year grant from IBM to develop some educational software. And this was when PCs were just beginning to move into schools. And I remember being at a meeting with the 2 cognitive scientists from IBM, sitting there with us doctoral students and our professors. And they both were just enthusing about how you're going to build the software now, but guess what? In another 20, 30 years, computers are going to be video driven. You won't need to have such high levels of literacy. This is how we're going to equalize the playing field. And that was their phrase, equalizing the playing field. And mind you, they were making this presentation to a group of doctoral students who were focused on reading. And the professors were famous reading people, reading researchers. So you can imagine what we thought. But we stuck with the project and we developed some really good software that had a shelf life of about 2 years. But as as the two of you were talking, though, I keep coming back to wanting to understand. And I'd love, I think, and some of the questions that have been coming in from our audience members too is trying to understand just really what's at the root of this national campaign. And it is a campaign, to constrict ideas and silence voices and to undo the right to read. What's going on here? What are your thoughts, the two of you?
Yeah, well, maybe I will, because, obviously, I think that's the important question. And I don't want to give an easy answer because I think the answers are really complex. But I think at the heart of it, and, of course, I love history. So I'm going back to the Reconstruction era. Since I talked about the Black Code laws and the Slave Code laws, I think that once we were able to see poor Black and Indigenous people after enslavement ended in this country, sort of enter into their communities as free people, participating in the political environment, running for office, setting up businesses, asking for to actual remuneration to actually be paid for their labor. We saw some of we saw one of the greatest periods of racial violence. We saw gender violence, and we saw really a crackdown in both segregation and just voter access. And I'm not saying that we're back there, but I do see some similarities. We have a greater number of people from different backgrounds entering into the economic marketplace. We have people asking for fair wages, asking for fair housing, asking for higher quality education, asking to have both their histories and their injuries recognized. And so we see the same crackdown, the crackdown on literature, on the right to read, the silencing, just the harsh violence, whether it's state violence or state condoned violence. And just think about what we've seen, since last January, right? I mean, if we were to go toe to toe with that playbook during that era of violence, we'll see that some of the same episodes are repeating themselves. And so what we're seeing really baldly, unfortunately, is the feudal hoarding of resources by a minority. And I'm not talking about race, but what I mean is that the vast number of people, and we have to understand this, the vast number of people want to do good, and they want to be in a society in which it's based on merit and sharing and mutual aid. We do that all the time, right? When disasters strike, people, are helping as much as they can. But when it comes to politics right now, we have to understand that people are trying to hoard power, and they're trying to recruit people who actually are not really interested in that level. They're not going to have access to that level of power anyway, but they're trying to recruit them into their campaign. That's why you see things like Moms for Liberty, which is like taking sometimes lower middle class folks who might feel threatened, for a lot of different reasons, but who may not necessarily be organizing around the right to read, and yet they're being recruited to do that. So it's pernicious. We have to call it what it is, but we have seen this before, unfortunately.
I would just add briefly that reading is powerful. If it wasn't, there wouldn't be so much danger in a book sitting on a shelf, right? We know that when we read about people that live differently or look differently than us, it creates empathy. And the book bans that we are seeing are not random. They're targeting very specific books, and in particular LGBTQIA+, and also authors of color. So those two groups are being hit very hard by these bans, and it makes you realize how powerful reading is, I guess.
To that point, Marie, one thing I just wanted, in terms of Nora saying that, books, we've seen books use, books as contraband, right? You look at today, in contemporary prisons, it isn't all books being banned, but sometimes it is specific types of books that are being banned. A lot of times, books that people say will make you question your incarceration. Those are books that are called out. But I just wanted to say that in the McCarthy era, one of the most banned books was Civil Disobedience by Thoreau. The only reason why that book was really sanctioned and censored as much is because it became an early primer for the civil rights movement. And we know that, the very beginning of that book says that every citizen must really question anything that is inherently promoting inequity. And it became a primer for whites and blacks in the civil rights movement. A lot has been focused on Gandhi, and of course, King was very much influenced by Gandhi. But in the 40s, in the sort of prelude, the early civil rights movement, it was Civil Disobedience. And that book and Robin Hood, because of its attack on wealth hoarding, were some of the most censored books of their day.
Well, this leads perfectly into one of the first questions we received is, a member of our audience would love for you to talk a little bit more about the relationship between information poverty and voting, and what do each of you see from the public library space, and then you, Nora, in the school library space. Where do you see your workplaces being able to educate voters, being able to foster that sense of inquiry in voters' minds.
Okay, well, my knowledge of this is much smaller and more specific than Tracie's, but I just, when I'm working with students and talking, I mean, information literacy is just discerning and figuring out, the background of a source. I just got a text today that was what I would consider a lie about how I should vote on November 8th. And I feel that I needed the skills that I have today in order to research that independently on my own and to know that this text was voter intimidation to get me to change what I had read. And I just think that's just incredibly important with our students. But
so Nora has talked about the kind of literacy and discernment and ability, information literacy in terms of being able to ferret out fake news that I think is necessary today. I taught a information literacy class for residents who are returning from incarceration, long bids of incarceration. I think the person who had served the shortest amount of time had served 13 years. But so, the biggest book ban in the world right now, especially in this country, is happening inside prisons. And so we can do another conversation about that. But just trying to talk to people about discerning information, which information, would lead them to a link that could take their information and use it, impersonate them, which information was, about getting people to participate in a business venture that might be high risk, which information, was false because it wanted people to vote in a particular way or carry a certain type of idea or to minimize a certain group of people's history. When I shared, when we were going through the course, one man who, had served almost 2 decades, he said, wait a minute. He said, wait a minute. He said, I don't know that I would have been able to detect any of this if I hadn't taken this workshop. And this is something that we should be teaching everyone. But I want to go to read something that's more fundamental too, even in terms of libraries, is that many libraries are also polling places, right? And when we were seeing the crackdown on people being able to absentee voting, in one of our more notorious elections, ALA really worked very hard to help some libraries become polling places in the 11th hour. And one of the things that we saw is that some of those same libraries experienced arson in some of the places where they were collecting ballots. Today, we have just gone through a period over 2 weeks where a number of libraries were receiving bomb threats and other threats of violence. And the American Library Association had to report that, gather all the information we could to the FBI. And so I just want to say that even the bricks and mortar, the very idea and construct of libraries in supporting literacy about voting and also access to voting is something that is also being contested.
1963. It's still 1963. Well, you actually gave me an opportunity, especially you, Nora, to plug our next forum, which is going to be on information, or on disinformation and what to do about it for teachers. And so I hope that everyone in the audience tonight, because we had many questions on this, will return in February, and we'll be getting the word out about that. Another thread or theme here that's been emerging from the questions and the comments has to do with, libraries and librarians as social workers. And for teachers and the librarians themselves, it begs the question: is this what? And I go through this as a teacher too, right? Is this what I signed up for? Is this what I trained to do? I'm not really a social worker. I'm not really, that wasn't what I thought I was going to be doing. Can you talk, each of you, about how you and your professional roles as librarians, seems to me you've been embracing that, and do you have advice for not necessarily burned out or more just weary, I guess, teachers and librarians? What keeps you going, given your roles have expanded, not necessarily by your design or desire? What's some advice to the weary, I guess?
Well, I'll just be quick because I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm a social worker who became a librarian. I was directing, I've, been interested, in housing precarity and working with people who are unhoused for a long time, because my own family had a brief history of being unhoused, and so the service to understanding that access to housing, consistent access to housing, is more of a privilege than we tend to talk about and think, is how I was raised. And so I think that, and I also became a librarian because having that experience, and I was thinking about maybe going on and doing a PhD and maybe teaching. And then I saw the role of the librarian as sort of like us in that space. I really saw the librarian as the public intellectual and the public scholar who brings resources that people need after observing and talking to them about their information needs, that brings the information that can help them really change and improve their lives as they see fit and as they want. And so I actually became a librarian because I thought I would have more of a capacity to turn to information into knowledge, and knowledge into mobility, and that I would have more of an opportunity to serve more people than I would in any other setting. So I actually like the nexus. I do think there's a deep distinction between the two, but I think wherever liminal space exists and that blurry space, that's the space I've always tried to occupy.
Well, I can add my wisdom as someone who, no, just kidding. I am completely and totally burned out, and I can't answer that question because I'm depleted and burned out like all educators right now. I think I agree with Tracie. There's a lot of there's a clear distinction, but there are a lot of commonalities in education and also in libraries, but I can't help.
Actually, I think you have. And then there's also been another thread, and in the time we have remaining, people really want to know from you, what specifically can they do about these book bans? People are really, the uniting, the ALA site, was very helpful and really appreciated. But do you have like one or two things that teachers, parents, community members can do? Like, what's the thing they should do tomorrow, if not tonight, beyond writing to their representatives, beyond, I don't know, bringing cookies to their local librarian? I mean, what can be done to really get after this?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think taking cookies to their local librarian and writing their, I think their elected officials, I think those are important. But I guess I would say, talk to people in your circle, whether that's your family or children or your friends, that having a book on the shelf in the public library is just that, or in the school library. It's having the book there, right? And so I think we do see some fear of unknowns, and the stories get bigger about what's actually happening in public libraries and in school libraries. But just this simple distinction between making a decision for yourself on what you want to read is very different than deciding for your community what they can read or what others can read. So just thinking about that distinction, I can choose what I want to read and what I want my family exposed to, and just like having that conversation with others and taking away some of the fear.
Yeah, and I would just say, I would add to that, first of all, have your librarians and your libraries back. If people are going through, if you hear somebody experiencing, a challenge, remember that librarians and library workers aren't inventing these texts, right? And even writers, they're writing based on observation. There are very few texts that we have, whether we love them or we don't, that aren't rooted in some part of who we are essentially as people. So one, stop being in denial. But the other thing is, like, don't take it lying down. Imagine and understand the connection between all of our freedoms and the right to read. And what we know is that when there's a violation that's unchecked of one freedom, it's a slippery slope for all the others. So stand up. Go to your library and say, I saw that there was a challenge. I want to let you know that I believe in the right to read. And I'm going to send this postcard. I'm bringing these cookies. I'm going to talk to people in my community. Talk to your friends. Resist. If there's a challenge in your child's school or at your public library, show up and be accounted for. Say, I don't agree. Even if I don't agree with what that book is saying, it represents a reality for someone. It could even be a cautionary tale. Some of our novels that are being challenged are Bilden's Roman novels. That's the coming of age novel, right? And so all those books are about the kinds of problems that someone may confront and how they survive them and integrate them and move on and, oftentimes become productive. And finally, read. If you see a book that's challenged, don't hop on the boat, actually read it. I think that would we would have no challenges at all if people actually had to read the entire book. But stand up for the right to read.
Amen. Well, a few of the accolades coming in about both of you. One is, just thanks so much, Tracie, for the slides that you shared, and having that concrete information is going to be helpful, especially when communicating with the eventual candidates for Chicago School Board. So thanks so much for that. And then also, Nora, thank you so much for your concrete suggestions and for making sure we don't give up. Thank you both for making such clear connections, especially you, Tracie, to the connections in U.S. history and enslavement, and providing that critical historical context, and sadly realizing just how it's mirrored today. One last question, if I may, and that is, how can local communities or organizations form libraries or build special libraries that collaborate with public and school libraries?
I'll jump out on this really quick, because this is such an important question. One thing is that, libraries are part of our formal sort of memory catching infrastructure. And I say memory because I call all of this memory work, right? That's exactly what it is. We are collecting and disseminating and archiving memory, how we thought, what we thought about, all those other kinds of things, the stories that we told. One thing is to recognize that some of our best libraries and some of our best realia, they die when people pass away. Start a community archiving project. Ask people to collect, if they, if sometimes people are letting go of books or things, ephemera that can be digitized in your community. If there's been like lots of programs or, arts programs, civic programs, capture all of that and turn that into a digital archive. Start your little free library in your community. Stock it with banned books. Understand that libraries are part of a memory network, and each of us has our part. So I'm glad that question was asked, because I believe that the informal aspects of information archiving and information access, we need to really stress those right now in these times. Thank you.
Thanks for those tips. I actually put 2 banned books in a little library in a neighborhood where I knew they wouldn't be appreciated. So that's me outing myself. Nora.
I agree with all that's been said, but I do think it's important to stress the difference with school libraries and public libraries having a librarian to curate a room with books is not adequate for our students, and it's not adequate for our public. So I would just add on, I think all of those ways of documenting and joining in is very important. And at the same time, we need to support and fund librarians as well.
We need the educated professionals.
We do, because we wouldn't be setting up community operating rooms, right? So I have to, I want to second that, Nora. I think that, just as in public health, and I, have that vantage point, obviously coming from my background, I'm always thinking what we can do that's attendant, but I want to underscore what Nora is saying. We need formal libraries, school, public, academic libraries to continue, and we need trained professionals to run and lead them. And so I want to just underscore that. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Well, again, I hope our speakers have enjoyed this opportunity as much as we have to spend this time with you. And I do want to remind everyone on YouTube that Will has put a number of resources to further your education about many of the issues that were raised tonight. And again, you can't hear everybody clapping, but again, thank you. Thank you so much for coming, and good night, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. See you in February.